Thank you for those of you that just joined us in your sitting practice and meditating with us. We're going to jump into a short little talk and then we'll have some time for you to send in your questions. But a couple promotional pieces first. You can visit us at www.oneminddharma.com to learn more about what we do. You can visit oneminddharma.com/daily to take a look at our weekly guided meditation podcast, our daily guided meditation emails, which is the way that we support ourselves. So we appreciate any support. And we also have a new mobile app for iPhones and Androids and tablets, oneminddharma.com/app. It has meditations, podcasts, our store, our blog. You can send us a text from the app or call us and download it, and we appreciate your support. So today I thought that we would talk about, we've received a lot of questions about this, and it's not something that is kind of a traditional Buddhist practice or Buddhist terminology really, but it's looking at anxiety and specifically the running mind. And there is a piece there that's related to the hindrance of restlessness and worry. But how to deal with that mind that just keeps going and going and going. And maybe it's during meditation practice and maybe not. My experience in teaching the groups that we teach at treatment centers and leading Insight Sonoma, as well as working one-on-one, is a lot of people actually come to meditation practice because of this, because of the mind that just seems to be overactive, whether it's when we go to bed at night and all the thoughts arise, or it's while we're trying to get work done. Many of us deal with this kind of mind that doesn't seem to shut up when we want it to shut up. I think that in order to take a look at why the mind does this and how we approach it, we first have to understand that the nature of the mind is that we can't control every thought that comes up. We have what we can call volitional and non-volitional thoughts. That is, there are thoughts that you can think on purpose. Like if I ask you to think right now of a golden retriever dog, you can probably picture one, perhaps one that you've known, or an image of one, and that's a volitional thought that you're choosing to think. On the other hand, if you're sitting there lying in bed at night and suddenly the thought comes up of something someone said to you when you were in middle school and how mean it was, that's a non-volitional thought. It can become volitional in that we begin to actively engage with it and be like, yeah, screw that person or whatever it is that arises. But a lot of the thoughts that come up are non-volitional in nature, meaning we don't want to think them. We're not choosing to think them. And I think the piece that comes after that is we also can't just choose to stop thinking them. This is the nature of the mind that we have to come to terms with if we're going to approach an overactive mind with any level of skillfulness. So knowing that, we can begin to not take the mind so personally. It's not your fault that the mind is thinking. It doesn't make you a bad person or a bad meditator especially. But to understand that that's what the mind's job is to do, is to think. The heart beats, the lungs take oxygen in and distribute it into the bloodstream. The mind thinks and processes information. It's not because your mind processes information. All minds process information. That's what they do. It's why we named what we do One Mind Dharma, with the idea that even though minds may be different, they often display similar patterns or the same patterns, that we all share these same qualities. Maybe they manifest in different ways. Some of us fall into overactive or anxiety. Others fall into sleepiness or laziness or sloth and torpor. But the mind processes information, tells us what's safe, tells us what's important, tells us what's right or wrong, perhaps. So to not take it so personally and to understand that. With the mind and with these active thoughts, our tendency can be to try to kind of push them down or stuff them down or take ourselves away from them. And we do that in a variety of ways. We can, of course, go the dramatic route with drugs and alcohol, or some kind of other addictive behavior and eating disorder. We can go something a little mellower, like some of us like to eat when we're feeling stressed, or some of us take naps when we're feeling stressed. And then there's that really kind of basic foundational level, the dukkha or discomfort or suffering, that subtle, maybe it's not a conscious thought, but that subtle feeling that we wish it was different than it is. We wish we were somewhere else. We wish the mind was different. We just somehow have that deep wish within us that it was different than it is right now. And to me, that's the biggest way in which we create suffering around an anxious or active mind, is this delusion, really, that if the mind was calmer, we would be happier. Now, I say delusion not in a mean way, but rather in like the true sense of the word, that we're not seeing clearly. The way to approach these states of mind or qualities of mind is not through pushing them down or wishing they weren't present. It's through changing our response to them. And I'll go into just really briefly with my limited understanding of how the brain works, that what happens is when you begin to get anxious and you get all activated around it, which is a natural response. So not to blame yourself, but when you get some energy built up around an anxious moment, what the brain is doing is recognizing a little bit of activation, and that this is important or bringing us danger. So every time you do that, every time you become activated, you're slightly perpetuating the anxious mind. And on the other hand, when the mind becomes anxious and we can respond with more equanimity and an ability to let go or calmness and clarity to it, the body doesn't get as activated around it, and the mind won't hold on to it as something that's dangerous or important, and we won't react so strongly. And the point being that we have this potential to snowball it towards more anxiety and more activation, which we often, and I'm not speaking at you, I'm speaking about myself as well. I've dealt with this. I've had anxiety to the point where when I first got sober and went to 12-step meetings, I would leave right before the meeting ended for two reasons. One, I didn't want to hold hands with people and say a prayer because it was like just scary to me. And I didn't want to get caught talking to people after the meeting. I had too much anxiety. Sitting in a room full of people was like my threshold. So I've dealt with this anxiety in different ways myself. But what we often do is we snowball it to create more anxiety for ourselves and more activation. And what we have the seed and power to do within us already is to snowball it in the other direction, really, to really kind of calm down around an anxious mind, if that makes sense. So how that looks for me is when I notice the mind going, to really try to stop, take a deep breath, and just look at it. It doesn't need any action always. It doesn't need me to stop it or slow it down. It doesn't even need me to try to breathe really deeply and slow my heart rate. Sometimes if, it's turning into some kind of on the cusp of like a panic attack or overwhelming, those things can be helpful. But most of the time, for me, in my experience, what's most helpful is just noticing, like, whoa, look at how fast these thoughts are going, or how invasive or pervasive this thought is. No matter what happens, this thought just keeps coming back up. And to really tune into it, what happens is the thought comes up, and so often we hook right into it and the thought takes us off with it, and we get wrapped up in this anxiety. And the practice is really to watch the thought come up and watch it from over here. Watch it with a little bit of distance. And that's not to say that we need to remove ourselves from the situation always, but really just mentally, as we watch the thoughts come up and don't attach or hook into them, we're able to see them with a little more clarity. I like to think that when you're right up against the thought, you can only see a little bit of it, whereas when you step back, you can kind of see the whole thought, or at least more of it, and it becomes a little clearer to see what's going on. The Buddha did recommend, the Buddha taught about 5 hindrances, and they're hindrances or obstacles or mental states that we come up against in meditation practice, and of course in daily life as well. And one of them is restlessness and worry, which, you can take it however you want. There's physical restlessness, and mental worry is kind of how I see it. But it really is that feeling of anxiety or too much energy. And the recommendation when the Buddha offered these hindrances that we all face was the number one recommendation was to notice them. That was the way that we free ourselves from these hindrances, is to notice them. And it does sound maybe like an oversimplification, but it is, much easier to say something is simple than to say it's easy. Because it's simple to say that the body needs to breathe to stay alive, but it's not easy for me to understand all the moving parts of that and how that works. It's simple. All we need to do is to observe the restlessness and worry. Now, putting that into practice is not easy. There are many different ways we can do that. One of them is a true Vipassana noting practice, as we just did in the meditation. And we can do it with not just the thinking mind, but of course, any of the sense doors, just really tuning into what's arising. What happens when we tune into things as they actually arise is we begin to see them before they're up here and controlling us. It's the example of one of my kind of go-to experiences was anger. When I was experiencing something unpleasant, I would turn towards anger. And I used to know I was angry when I was furious, like when my fists were clenched or I was screaming at someone, just like in rage, really. And now I notice anger when it's coming up as like frustration or irritation. And I can see it kind of bubbling up, not, exploding up. Because what happens is, that frustration kind of builds and builds and builds, and then suddenly, I'm in a fit of rage and I don't know where it came from. But if I tune into that frustration and irritation or whatever is going on, pain perhaps underneath the anger, fear, that I can really begin to respond to it and tend to it there before it's not that it's too late, but before it's caused even more suffering to myself and perhaps someone else. And it's the same with anxiety, that as we begin to notice the thoughts come up, we can tend to them and look at them with care and look at them with some wisdom and not just, find ourselves in that moment of overwhelm. The way the noting practice works is simply noting what's coming up. So I use it with the sense doors. So I'll sit and I'll just note hearing, body, thoughts, seeing, whatever sense door is kind of being engaged. And it helps me to see what's going on, but we don't attach into it. So it's just getting up, bringing the awareness close enough to something to see it, but not really holding on to it. Another practice we can do for ourselves, and something I found incredibly beneficial in my own life, is some loving kindness practice, some metta practice for ourselves. As we cultivate this ability to respond with more friendliness and gentleness, what ends up happening is when we have that moment of realizing that we're in a state of anxiety, we don't react and judge ourselves. We react with like, oh, I need some kindness and some tenderness. And we can actually kind of mellow out the anxiety rather than exacerbating it with that reactivity. And that can make all the difference. It can send us from, anxious to overwhelmed, or anxious to mindful and anxious, I guess. And that's the last piece I'd like to offer on this topic of anxiety is really the practice is to bring mindfulness to it. And we've talked a lot about that. We just did a podcast on Dharma Talk about it. But like, what is mindfulness? What does that mean to bring mindfulness to anxiety? And it's a couple things. One, it means being aware of it, as I kind of just was talking about. So whether you're in a state of intense anxiety or it's just bubbling up the thoughts, to bring awareness to it, and to especially bring awareness to it and recognize it in meditation practice. So as we begin to recognize how the thoughts are arising, we can begin to take that out of our practice and see it in daily life. So number one is to recognize it. That's, an important part of mindfulness, to know what's going on. And then the other piece of mindfulness is to also recognize if, there's many ways that it's phrased, but if it's causing suffering or it's creating liberation. In 12-step rooms, they say, is it causing recovery or relapse or helping or hurting? I had a therapist say to me once, I'm sure in that moment I was probably hurting and that's why he said that to me. But is our behavior or is our reaction or is this mental state, Is it causing more suffering or reaction to it, or is it going to cause liberation? So mindfulness is not 100% just being in the present moment. There's a tiny piece of it that's recognizing pieces of the past. So we know, for example, if we just try to stuff something down, it's going to cause suffering. We've had that experience in the past. So there's a piece of mindfulness that is grabbing information from the past. And then there's also a piece of mindfulness that's a little bit future oriented. And that's to say that, okay, I'm having some anxiety, the thoughts are arising, or maybe it's a thought that I've been thinking about a lot and I don't want to. I know that in the past, and it's not this concrete always, we kind of have an intuitive sense. I know that when this thought has arisen, or these types of thought, and I've pushed them down, it hasn't worked for me in the past. So I'm not going to do that for my future. So it's not to say that we need to dwell in the past or future trip by any means, but I do think it's incorrect to say that mindfulness is all about the present moment, because it's not. We're always grabbing information from the past, and we're always recognizing what it may cause in the future. And that's not to say that we know if we don't stuff it down, we'll just be free of it. We don't know what the future holds or how the mind's going to behave. But we do know and have the ability to see what's going to cause more suffering and what's going to cause liberation. It's not to say that there's a black and white, right or wrong. And I actually think we should probably get away from that dualistic thinking. But in this case, there are generally ways of responding that are leading us more towards somewhere on that spectrum of suffering and liberation. So coming back to the anxiety, to be aware of it when it's present, and then to know what response is skillful and what's not. And then that last piece of to really respond with some kindness, to not push it down, to not judge yourself. You can use some wise discernment of knowing, I don't need to buy into this thought. But we don't need to be so harsh with ourselves, to be kind and gentle and to soften around it, to really allow it to be there and remember this. Just try to remember, try to believe, try to investigate. If you allow the anxiety to be there and work on changing your reaction to it, is that perhaps more fruitful than trying to get rid of the anxiety altogether? So, those three pieces of be aware in the present moment of it when it arises, especially meditation practice. Notice what the right way to respond to it is, and really try to bring some kindness to your response, some gentleness with yourself. So that's all I have to say for now. We're going to take some questions. You can text your questions if you're watching this live to the number that we gave you, and we will answer some questions.